The basement air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and ozone. Leo sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The blue light etched sharp lines into his face, illuminating the text of a rejection email from Wall Street Capital Partners. It was his 5th application this month. He read the words again, though he already knew them by heart. He slammed the laptop shut. The sound echoed off the concrete walls like a gunshot, dying out in the cramped, windowless space. Leo pushed his chair back and glanced at the trash can. It was overflowing with crumpled, discarded letters. Every sheet of paper represented a closed door. He stood up, his legs stiff from hours of sitting, and looked around the room. There was nothing here but shadows, cold concrete, and the persistent hum of the cooling fan. He took a breath, but the air felt heavy, stagnant, as if the room itself were resisting his presence. He had nowhere else to go. Outside, the world was moving on without him, leaving him buried in this cellar, waiting for a signal that never came. He stared at the closed laptop, his hands clenched at his sides, feeling the silence of the house pressing down against the floorboards above. Leo climbed the stairs, the creak of the wood floor signaling his arrival. The kitchen was a battlefield of domestic tension. Mara stood at the sink, her grip tight on a frying pan. She scrubbed the surface with frantic, rhythmic swipes, the metal screeching against metal. She did not look up when he entered. She stopped scrubbing, the silence hanging heavy between them. She turned, pointing a damp cloth toward the kitchen table. "There is a position open at the local bank," she said. 40,000 a year. It is stable. It is real. Leo felt his pulse thrumming in his throat. He looked at her hands, then at the sink. He refused to look at the floor. "I am not taking that job," Leo replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his fingers. Mara dropped the pan into the basin with a heavy clatter. "Stability is not a choice, Leo. It is a necessity." She waited for a counter, but he gave her none. He stood his ground, the weight of her expectation pressing against him. He turned back toward the stairs, his mind already retreating to the dark space below, where the only path forward was the one he had yet to build. The basement door clicked shut behind him, sealing out the sound of the kitchen. Leo walked to the corner, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He pulled out his phone and opened his bank app. The screen glowed in the dim light, displaying a balance of $1,000. It was his entire reserve. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty desk. He could take the job at the bank, earn a steady paycheck, and end the friction upstairs. He stared at the screen, his thumb hovering over the interface. He swiped down, closed the app, and opened a browser. He navigated to an online auction site he had been tracking for weeks. A used desktop, 2 high-resolution monitors, and a reliable connection hub. The price, including shipping, was $300. He tapped the buy button. The confirmation screen blinked into view. $700 remained. He set the phone down on the concrete floor. The transaction was complete. There was no going back to the bank now. He looked at the empty space where the equipment would arrive, his breathing evening out as the finality of the gamble settled into his bones. The delivery boxes arrived on a Tuesday, stacked high against the cold concrete wall. Bed frame groaned, dismantled, dragged to basement. He hauled the mattress into the storage closet, leaving the corner bare. He spent the next 3 hours assembling the desk. He bolted the monitors to the mounting arms, routing the cables through plastic sleeves to keep the surface clean. The room changed. The air smelled of fresh plastic and heated silicone. He arranged the keyboard and mouse, aligning them with the edge of the desk. He turned on the power. The monitors flickered to life, casting a harsh, artificial blue glow across the low ceiling. He pulled a chair into the center of the setup. He sat. There was no bed left. There was no place to sleep. The space was no longer a room for rest. It was a cockpit. He adjusted the brightness of the screens, the light etching sharp lines into his face. He watched the lines of data begin to populate the display. He did not look back toward the stairs. He remained seated, staring into the flickering light, his hands resting on the desk, waiting for the market to move. The market opened with a sharp, jagged spike. Leo adjusted his position, his fingers flying across the keys to lock in an entry point. He watched the green candles climb, expecting the trend to hold. It did not. Without warning, the price collapsed. He stared at the screen as the value of his position began to hemorrhage. He tried to exit, but the spread widened, locking him into a losing trade. His heart hit his ribs as he watched the account balance tick downward. 400 lost, 600 gone. He slammed his hand against the desk, but the software did not care about his frustration. The final number flashed on the screen. $800 vanished in less than a minute. The silence in the basement felt heavier now. The blue light from the monitors reflected in his wide, unblinking eyes. He leaned back, his chair creaking against the concrete floor. His hands hovered over the keyboard, but he did not move. The total remaining in his account was barely enough to cover his next meal. He watched the numbers continue to fluctuate, a cold, indifferent stream of data that had just stripped away his confidence and his remaining capital in a single, brutal heartbeat. The screen displayed a static, mocking red. Leo pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping against the concrete. He did not look at the door. He did not look at the stairs. He reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a leather-bound ledger. The pages were crisp, untouched. He opened to the first blank sheet and picked up a heavy fountain pen. His hands were still trembling, but he held the pen with a white-knuckled grip. He pressed the nib into the paper. The ink bloomed as he wrote. He did not write about the money. He did not write about his fear. He wrote 4 words: "Do not chase the trend." He pressed harder, the nib tearing slightly into the fiber of the page. He stared at the ink until it dried. It was a cold, hard anchor in a room that felt like it was spinning. He set the ledger down on the desk, directly beside the keyboard. He looked back at the monitors. The charts were still moving, still inviting, still dangerous. He did not click. He did not buy. He simply watched the price action, his finger hovering inches above the mouse, testing the weight of his own restraint. He was no longer playing. He was studying. The basement air grew stale, but Leo did not notice. Weeks bled into one another, measured only by the steady, rhythmic pulse of the screens. He stopped clicking. He stopped reacting to every minor fluctuation. The harsh, clinical blue light that had once etched sharp shadows into his face began to soften, filtered through hours of relentless focus. By the 10th week, the monitors shifted into a deep, steady amber glow. The charts, once a chaotic maze of jagged lines and confusing indicators, smoothed out into a predictable rhythm. He leaned back, his eyes tracing the movement not as a series of prices, but as a living, breathing current of human intent. He saw the hesitation of buyers before the dip. He sensed the exhaustion of sellers before the breakout. The data was no longer a wall of noise. It was a transparent map of human behavior. He sat perfectly still, his breathing slow and shallow. The fan of the computer hummed a low, constant note in the silence of the concrete room. He reached out and touched the edge of the screen, his fingertips catching the warmth of the glass. He had stopped fighting the market. He was finally reading it. Leo wiped his palms against his legs. $500. That was the total remainder of his existence. He opened the terminal window, his cursor hovering over the configuration setting. One final check of the connection. The software blinked, awaiting confirmation to switch from demo mode to live. He took a breath, held it, and clicked the toggle. The interface color shifted from the familiar amber to a sharp, high-contrast white. The reality of the numbers hit him immediately. These were no longer phantom points. They were his survival. He pushed his chair closer to the desk, the wheels grinding slightly against the uneven concrete floor. The room felt smaller, the air tighter. He rested his hands on the desk, fingers splayed, feeling the vibration of the cooling fans against the wood. He He stared at the digital clock in the corner of the primary monitor. 9 hours, 29 minutes, and 55 seconds. He closed his eyes, listening to the silence of the basement. He was ready. 9 hours, 29 minutes, and 59 seconds. The digital clock ticked over. The opening bell rang through his speakers, a sharp, resonant sound that felt like a physical blow against his chest. The market was open. The game had stopped. Leo clicked the mouse. The execution order registered instantly. He watched the NASDAQ contract ticker, his eyes darting across the spread. The numbers crawled upward for a heartbeat, then stuttered. The price dropped. A red negative sign flickered onto the screen, minus $45.
His pulse spiked, a rhythmic thumping against his eardrums that drowned out the hum of the cooling fans. This was not the simulation. This was his last $500 bleeding away in real time.
He felt his fingers tighten into fists, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the desk. The temptation to panic, to hit the sell button and stop the drain, clawed at his resolve.
His breathing turned jagged. He forced his eyes away from the descending numbers.
He looked at the edge of his monitor, where he had taped a small, yellow sticky note. The ink was faded, but the message was sharp. Trust the data. He forced his jaw to unclench. He focused on the rhythm of the market flow, ignoring the phantom itch to retreat. He kept his hands hovering above the keyboard, refusing to move, refusing to surrender to the initial shock of the downward trend. The red numbers on the screen stabilized. For 3 seconds, they flickered between minus 45 and minus 50, hovering at the edge of his tolerance. Then, the volume bars at the base of his screen surged upward. The price began to climb, pulling away from the red zone with sudden, violent force. Leo watched the candles on the chart shift from hollow to solid. He did not blink. He waited for the specific resistance point he had spent weeks studying. The ticker crossed his threshold. He clicked the mouse. The trade executed. A crisp, digital chime echoed through the quiet basement, cutting through the low hum of the hardware.
It was a sharp, clean sound. The screen flashed a green bore. Profit realized. Leo leaned back.
The chair springs groaning under the shift in his weight. He exhaled, his lungs finally releasing the air he had been hoarding.
He looked at the total. The $500 had survived, and now it had grown. He looked at the ledger, his hand steady as he picked up the pen. He did not write about his relief. He wrote only the number, the time, and the price of entry. The market continued to move, but the frantic pulse in his throat had vanished. He was no longer reacting to the screen. He was anticipating it. The basement door creaked open, the sound unfamiliar after months of near-total silence. Leo stepped into the kitchen light, his eyes adjusting to the brightness. The room remained exactly as it had been. The same worn linoleum, the same scent of burnt coffee. Mara stood by the counter, her back to him, scrubbing a plate with the same rhythmic, frustrated motion he remembered from the beginning. She did not turn when he entered. Leo walked to the center of the room. He reached into his pocket.
His movements deliberate and slow. He pulled out a thick, banded stack of $100 bills. He did not say a word.
He let the stack fall onto the wooden surface of the table. The sound was heavy, a dull thud that killed the sound of the scrubbing. Mara froze. The sponge dropped into the soapy water with a soft splash. She turned slowly, her gaze dropping from his face to the pile of cash. She reached out, her fingers hovering inches from the paper. Then she touched the edges. She did not look up. Her hands began to shake, the tremor visible against the stillness of the table. The silence in the kitchen stretched, heavy and absolute, replacing the long-standing tension of the previous months with a new, sharper reality. The money on the table was only the beginning. Leo walked back down the stairs, the door clicking shut behind him. He returned to the screens. The basement had become an extension of his own focus. He watched the order flow, the numbers cascading in a rhythmic pulse that matched his own heartbeat. Each trade was a calculated movement, a series of small, disciplined wins that compounded with terrifying speed. He tracked the growth, the digits on his account balance climbing through the 5-figure range. The market was a machine, and he had learned to operate its gears. Week after week, he pushed the capital back in, reinvesting every cent. He traded through the volatility, ignoring the noise of the headlines. He tracked the cumulative total as it approached the target. 100,000, then 110. The pressure in the room shifted, the air thinning as he neared the milestone. He executed the final series of contracts just as the closing bell neared. The screen updated one last time. The balance displayed $142,000. He stopped. He stared at the terminal. The number sat there, static and solid, a wall of green figures that erased every rejection he had ever received. He pushed his chair back from the desk. The silence in the basement was no longer a cage. It was the sound of a foundation being laid. Mara sat at the worn kitchen table, her gaze fixed on the printed statement Leo had laid before her.
The paper was crisp, a sharp contrast to the frayed edges of their life. She traced the bottom line figure with a trembling finger,
her breath catching in her throat. She looked up at Leo, then back at the numbers.
as if the ink might vanish if she blinked. The kitchen, once a space of constant grinding pressure,
suddenly felt silent. No more talk of local bank clerks or $40,000 loans.
The weight that had defined her posture for years finally began to shift. She let out a long, ragged exhale.
And the first tear fell, hitting the printed paper with a soft, dark spot. More followed, carving slow, steady paths through the fatigue etched into her face. She did not sob. She simply sat there.
The air finally clear of the static that had filled the room for so long. Leo moved toward her, his footsteps heavy on the floorboards. He reached out, his hand resting on her shoulder.
And the tension that had held her frame together for months finally snapped. She leaned into his touch, her shoulders dropping.
The struggle for survival had ended, leaving behind only the quiet, overwhelming reality of a life reclaimed. The basement was now a memory, a laboratory left behind. Leo stepped out into the morning light, the air of the city feeling different than it had months ago. He moved toward the financial district, his stride steady, his focus sharp. The skyscrapers rose like glass monoliths around him, catching the sun and reflecting it down onto the bustling streets. Where he once felt small beneath the weight of these institutions, he now walked among them with an unhurried rhythm. He navigated the crowded sidewalk, watching the sea of people rushing toward their shifts. They moved with a frantic, desperate energy, eyes fixed on watches, pulses driven by the demands of the clock. Leo stood apart from that current. He checked his watch, not to track a deadline, but to gauge the market opening. He reached the center of the district, finding a vantage point near the exchange. The noise of the city, the screech of tires, the blare of horns, the chatter of thousands washed over him, but he remained anchored. He was no longer looking for a seat at the table. He was simply waiting for the bell to ring so he could return to work. He scanned the plaza, his expression unreadable, waiting for the exact moment the market would yield to his command. Leo stepped into the lobby of a coffee shop near the exchange. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted beans and the sharp, metallic tang of espresso machines. He moved toward the counter, his pace deliberate. A man pushed out from the crowd, colliding with Leo's shoulder. It was Julian. He looked exhausted, his eyes darting toward the street as if he were being hunted by a deadline. Julian did not apologize. He looked Leo up and down, his gaze lingering on the fabric of Leo's shirt before his lip curled into a sneer.
"Leo, I heard you were still playing around with those home screens," Julian said.
His voice rising above the grinding of a milk frother. He gestured toward his own wrist,
tapping a watch that seemed to be synced to a global pulse. I just closed my third deal this week for the firm.
80 hours is a light stretch when you are gunning for associate at Goldman. Julian leaned in, his posture stiff, projecting the frantic energy of a man tethered to a desk. He did not ask how Leo was doing. He simply waited for a reaction, his ego demanding a display of envy that Leo did not provide. Leo remained silent, his hands tucked into his pockets, observing the tremor in Julian's jaw. Julian kept talking, his words a rapid-fire list of responsibilities and office politics. Leo watched him, noting the dark circles under his eyes and the way his fingers drummed against the side of his espresso cup. It was a rhythm of constant, low-level anxiety. Julian paused for breath, waiting for a nod or a sign of intimidation. Leo did not provide it. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket and tapped the screen once. He held the device out, positioning it squarely between them. Julian leaned in, his expression shifting from arrogance to confusion. The display glowed with a single, bold figure: $14,000, the daily profit for the current session.
The air around the espresso machine seemed to thin. Julian went silent, his jaw hung slightly open, his eyes tracking the neon green digits as if they were a glitch in his reality. He looked at the phone, then back at Leo.
Then at the phone again. His hand stopped drumming. The corporate veneer he carried like armor began to crack. He stammered, trying to facade a question, but the numbers held all the answers. He stood frozen, his own 80-hour work week suddenly rendered irrelevant by the data on the screen. The silence in the shop turned absolute, punctuated only by the distant hiss of steam. Julian stood anchored to the floor tiles, his gaze glued to the phone screen. He did not blink. He did not speak. The frantic energy that had defined his posture moments ago evaporated, leaving him looking smaller, hunched against the weight of his own sudden insight. Leo reached out and pulled the device back. The screen went black with a single click. The sharp, mechanical snap echoed in the quiet space between them. Julian shifted his feet, his mouth working silently as he tried to bridge the gap between his reality and the numbers he had just witnessed. Leo did not offer a parting word or a nod of recognition. There was nothing left to explain. He turned his back on the espresso counter and began to walk. His stride was steady, measured, and unhurried. He passed through the heavy glass doors, the sudden rush of city air hitting his face. Behind him, Julian remained exactly where he had been left, a static figure trapped in the center of the bustling lobby. Leo stepped onto the sidewalk and merged into the flow of the street, leaving the shadow of the corporate ladder behind him for good. The heavy door clicked shut, sealing out the noise of the city streets below. Here, the air was still and smelled faintly of floor wax and fresh air. Leo walked to the floor-to-ceiling glass that spanned the entire north wall. Sunlight flooded the space, turning the hardwood floors into a mirror of gold. He stood for a long moment, watching the traffic patterns weave through the canyons of steel and glass far beneath his feet. The city looked fragile from this height, a grid of lines he had finally learned how to read. He turned away from the view and moved to the center of the room. A single, wide desk occupied the space, its surface clear of everything but 2 monitors and a mouse. No piles of paper, no stacks of rejection letters, no signs of the old struggle. He pulled his chair out, the wheels gliding silently across the polished wood. He sat down and adjusted the height with a single, practiced motion. The screens pulsed with a soft, steady light, waiting for his input. He breathed in, the sound deep and even, and rested his hands on the desk. He was no longer climbing toward a goal set by others. He was the architect of his own time, and the day was just beginning. Leo tapped the mouse to wake the secondary monitor. A small window flickered to life in the corner of the display. It was an automated alert, a remnant of a program he had set up months ago. The subject line read, "Entry-level clerk position, $18 an hour." He stared at the text. The words looked thin and brittle against the backdrop of his current account balance. He remembered the cold basement,
the smell of ozone, and the desperation that had once forced him to hunt for such crumbs.
The window vanished, leaving the screen clean and silent. He refreshed the page. The notification was gone, replaced by a live ticker of global market fluctuations. He leaned back in his chair, his posture loose and unburdened. The last tether to his former life had been severed by a single, deliberate movement. He closed the browser tab. The room felt larger, the air lighter, and the focus on his monitors sharpened into a single, crystalline point of intent. He was no longer waiting for an invitation to participate in the world. He was prepared to dictate his own terms. The digital clock on the corner of his screen flickered from 9:29 to 9:30. The silence in the room deepened, punctuated only by the faint hum of cooling fans. Leo watched the data streams, the lines shifting in a fluid, rhythmic dance. He did not lean forward. He remained centered, his back straight against the leather of his chair. The market opened with a sudden, sharp surge in volume, the numbers on the screen beginning to blur as they accelerated. He did not chase the movement. He anticipated the pivot point, his eyes tracking the flow of capital with absolute precision. He leaned back, his eyes fixed on the unfolding sequence of numbers. He was not looking at a ladder of employment or the expectations of others. He was looking at the tangible results of his own discipline. He moved his hands from the desk, folding them in his lap, and watched as the market moved exactly as he had calculated. The city's skyline outside the window remained motionless, but inside the room, he was the force that set the pace. He was no longer a participant in a system he could not control. He owned the ground he stood on.